Welkom allemaal bij deze vergadering-conferentie van de CRB. Bienvenue à tous à cette conférence du Conseil central de l'économie. Permettez-moi quelques mots d'introduction pour lancer la première conférence d'un cycle qui va nous entraîner sur l'année 2020 et en partie 2021. Donc, à la demande des partenaires sociaux, le Conseil central de l'économie lance donc un grand débat public sur l'avenir des finances publiques et notamment la gouvernance budgétaire européenne, mais aussi la gouvernance budgétaire intra-belge. Alors, cette réflexion sur l'avenir des finances publiques et cette gouvernance des finances publiques avait démarré au niveau européen également avant la crise que nous connaissons actuellement, mais la crise évidemment a donné une autre dimension encore à cette réflexion sur la gouvernance budgétaire européenne. Il est vrai qu'évidemment les enjeux en termes de vieillissement sont toujours bien présents, mais les finances publiques ont subi évidemment fortement la crise de 2020 et en partie certainement celle de 2021, et donc il se pose plein de questions évidemment sur la manière avec laquelle nous allons rendre nos finances publiques soutenables. Et un des objectifs de toutes ces conférences, ça serait de définir ce qu'on peut appeler la soutenabilité des finances publiques. Rien que le concept mérite d'ailleurs une conférence, mais comment on va pouvoir répondre aux défis gigantesques qui nous attendent demain en termes économiques, en termes sociaux, en termes environnementaux et en termes de gestion de la dette publique. Donc aujourd'hui, nous avons évidemment la chance d'accueillir un économiste, un des spécialistes au sein de la Commission européenne de cette gouvernance budgétaire européenne, à qui on a demandé évidemment, on a donné comme mission particulière d'essayer de nous remettre tous à niveau, puisque avant de débattre des modifications et d'évaluer évidemment cette gouvernance globale dans laquelle on est en termes de finances publiques, il nous semblait évidemment important que nous parlions tous de la même chose et donc de remettre entre guillemets un petit peu tout le monde à niveau sur cette gouvernance budgétaire, sur ce Stability and Growth Pact qui est quand même assez compliqué et la Commission elle-même a procédé à cette évaluation. Donc aujourd'hui évidemment un grand merci à Monsieur Van Houten d'être présent aujourd'hui. Et qui va évidemment nous présenter évidemment ce programme de croissance et de stabilité. Alors, je vous demanderai évidemment de couper vos micros et d'utiliser le chat pour poser des questions. Donc, nous allons après, avec Chris de Groot, que vous devez voir à l'image, donc rassembler ces questions. Donc le débat sera en français, en néerlandais et en anglais, parce que je pense que la présentation de M. Van Houten est en anglais, mais qu'il répondra volontiers, si mes informations sont correctes, en français et en néerlandais. Et donc avec Chris, nous animerons ces questions que vous aurez pu poster évidemment durant toute la présentation et après durant le débat. Peut-être dernier élément pour alimenter évidemment cette réflexion qui va durer un certain nombre de mois. Donc, si vous allez sur le site, et vous l'avez vu puisque vous êtes connecté pour vous connecter aujourd'hui à la conférence, on va lancer une plateforme web pour alimenter ce débat citoyen qu'on veut être ouvert au maximum à la société civile, dépasser évidemment les experts et les spécialistes des finances publiques pour avoir cette réflexion la plus citoyenne possible, puisque les finances publiques, évidemment, c'est le cœur de la décision politique, c'est le cœur de la décision publique. Et donc, il est important que ce débat soit compréhensible et dépasse évidemment le champ des experts. Donc, cette plateforme, elle aura pour utilité, évidemment, non seulement de vous informer sur toutes les initiatives que nous allons prendre dans les prochains mois, on alimentera avec toutes les publications que nous allons trouver et qui sont en lien avec la matière, et ça sera aussi l'occasion pour chacun d'entre vous de pouvoir évidemment poser des questions, de pouvoir déposer des avis, donc d'alimenter le débat que l'on veut le plus ouvert et le plus constructif possible. Monsieur Van Houten, je vous laisse la parole en vous remerciant encore de votre disponibilité aujourd'hui.
Merci beaucoup, dank u wel. En goedenamiddag aan iedereen. Bonjour à tous. Yeah, I will indeed make my presentation in English, but if there are questions in Dutch or French, I am glad to reply in those languages as well. So yeah, it's an honor and an opportunity to be invited by the Central Economic Council. So I'm very thankful for that. But it's also a challenge to explain the whole Stability and Growth Pact in around 1 hour. So I will do my best to present the main elements of this set of budgetary rules that exist at EU level. So I will try to give you the big picture with somewhat more details on a number of elements. And then, of course, if there are questions, I'm glad to answer them after the presentation. I will start with sketching the origins of the Stability and Growth Pact in the 90s. Then I will explain a bit more the development of the pact over time with the reforms of 2005 and 2011 of the fiscal rules. And then my main focus will be on the current functioning of the two arms of the pact. On the one hand, we have the preventive arm, and on the other hand, the so-called corrective arm of the pact. So let's start first with the origins and the legal basis of this set of fiscal rules. So first of all, it's important to understand the rationale for the EU's fiscal framework. The EU and the Europe and the EU's economic and monetary union is a unique model with a common monetary policy, but with fiscal policies remaining at national level. When I refer to fiscal policies, I mean what we call in French politique budgétaire, budgétaire beleid in Dutch, and not tax policy, of course. So fiscal policies remaining in the hands of member states, while monetary policy, since the creation of the euro, is the exclusive competence of the European Central Bank. Which focuses on price stability and which can support the euro area economy in the case of common economic shocks. So economic shocks common to all member states. Member states themselves, they don't have the instrument of monetary policy anymore to cope with economic shocks. Then at the same time, as said, member states have retained the full authority of their fiscal policy in their country with and they have kept the authority to set the level of taxes and the level of public expenditure. And this national fiscal policy in a monetary union presents two main issues or challenges. On the one hand, fiscal policy at country level is important for country-specific economic shocks. Because as I said, the member states do not longer have the monetary policy as an instrument or exchange rate, for example, to stabilize the economy. But at the same time, so they don't have this monetary instrument anymore, but they keep the fiscal instrument, but their fiscal behavior has potential negative consequences for other member states, what we call spillovers. Fiscal policy has traditionally a deficit bias, meaning that governments don't fully incorporate the negative consequences of higher public deficits in their decisions. And this is even more present in a monetary union, where part of the cost of higher deficits, for example, through higher interest rates, is borne by other member states. And so the creation of the monetary union increased this deficit bias and entailed the risk of moral hazard, and therefore it was viewed as important with the creation of the monetary union to have some binding limits in place, where before there were markets via interest rates, government interest rates having kind of binding function or putting certain limits. And so it was agreed that, or it was in the 90s, that with the creation of the monetary union, it was agreed to have this certain common fiscal rules to avoid that member states would have what we call excessive deficits. So these rules were needed to ensure that monetary policy could fully play its roles, that there were stable and appropriate conditions for the European Central Bank to focus on price stability. More recently, there is also the concern that fiscal rules are needed to avoid sovereign debt crisis, or to avoid that public debt levels become unsustainable, and that this would require a bailout in order to rescue the monetary union. So this to put a bit the scene why there are why there is the need for fiscal rules in a monetary union, in a nutshell. So this led to the creation of a rules-based framework called the Stability and Growth Pact, where member states remain responsible for the conduct of fiscal policy, but where this fiscal policy should be compatible with certain common rules to avoid, as I explained, putting in danger the economic and monetary union. And so the origins are found in the Maastricht Treaty signed in 1992, where the common monetary policy and a single currency were launched. And the treaty established the basic requirements for economic cooperation and surveillance, and also the principle of avoidance of excessive deficits and debts. And to this treaty was a protocol annexed, which defines two binding thresholds. On the one hand, the deficit criterion, so deficits should remain below 3% of GDP, and on the other hand, a public debt ceiling. Public debt should remain below 60% or sufficiently diminishing towards the 60% of GDP when that is higher. And so on this basis, more detailed rules were adopted in 1997 by the Council, just before the introduction of the euro. Just before the introduction of the euro. This framework consists of two regulations that impose rules on governments, on government budget balances and on government debt. And one is called the preventive arm, aiming to ensure that member states have sound budgetary fundamentals. And the other one is called the corrective arm regulation, which aims to correct a breach of the treaty reference value. So when the deficit is above 3% or the debt above 60%, then this corrective arm, or also called the excessive deficit procedure, aims to correct this situation. And in principle, when member states comply with the preventive arm, the public finances should be strong enough, sound enough to ensure that the recourse to the corrective arm is not needed, at least not in normal times. Then, in addition, there is a whole set of commonly agreed guidelines that further specify the implementation of the legal provisions. And these guidelines, they have been agreed among member states, and they are put together in the so-called Code of Conduct. And it includes, for example, a commonly agreed position on flexibility within the Stability and Growth Pact. I will come back to this. Its rules how the Commission should take into account cyclical conditions or structural reforms or investment when assessing member states' compliance with these regulations of the preventive and corrective arm. Then, before turning to the main features of the Stability and Growth Pact, let me have this slide on the division of tasks in the area of fiscal policy. So member states are free to set tax and spending levels, provided that they are compatible with the common rules for deficit and debt. Then each spring, member states have to submit their medium-term budgetary targets to the Commission and to the Council in a so-called stability or convergence program. So it's always by the end of April, and Belgium just submitted its stability program for the years to come. And so these medium-term plans will be assessed by the Commission and Council and allow for coordination of fiscal policies. Then Euro area member states also have to submit each year, each autumn, a detailed draft budgetary plan with their budget plans for the next year. Again, to allow for ex-ante coordination and to allow for an assessment by the Commission and the Council. So the European Commission is then in charge of assessing member states' public finances. So twice a year, I said. In the spring, the Commission assesses not only the medium-term plans, but also the outcome of the previous year. And then in autumn, there is the assessment of the plans for the next year, the draft budgetary plans. This is also only for Euro area member states. And then based on these plans, the Commission formulates proposals to the Council of Ministers, so to the Ministers of Finance of the EU member states, proposals with recommendations for fiscal policy for member states. Also can be proposals for legal steps to be taken against member states that do not comply with the rules of the pact. And so these proposals for guidance and proposals for legal steps are then assessed or discussed by the Council of Ministers, and it's the Council that then endorses or amends the Commission proposal. So in the end, it's the member states that in the Council that ultimately decide on the application of the pact, although the role of the Commission has increased with subsequent reforms. Then I can also mention the fiscal compact, which is mentioned on the slide under member states. It's in fact an intergovernmental treaty outside the EU framework, so outside of the Stability and Growth Pact. And in this treaty, member states agreed a number of requirements for national fiscal frameworks, for example, on the role of national institutions, or the obligation for member states that participate in this fiscal compact to have a binding fiscal rule in their legislation, their national legislation. Then I would like to highlight some important evolutions of the EU fiscal framework. So initially, the pact started as a fairly simple set of rules for public deficit and debt levels, focusing just on the deficit of member states and to some extent also on the debt. But then it evolved to a fairly complex and also more adaptable set of rules. The initial rules only looked at headline deficit numbers, so in difference between the revenues and expenditure, and this was found too simple or too rigid or even too stupid, according to the Commission President at the time, Romani Prodi. So it was found that this focusing on the 3% did not make much sense. So over time, the rules became economically smarter and provided more room to take into account so the economic cycle, but also country-specific circumstances. At the same time, these developments, this evolution made the framework also increasingly complex and less predictable, which makes it also easier for governments, I would say, to ignore the rules. So a first big reform was in 2005 with the aim to strengthen the economic rationale by better taking into account economic circumstances. And at that time, the concept of structural budget balance was introduced in the framework. And this is a very important concept as it is still central in today's framework. The structural budget balance is the difference between government's expenditures and revenue, but corrected for the impact of the economic cycle on the budget balance, and also corrected for one-off elements that distort the reading of public deficits. So this has the economic cycle has, of course, an important impact on government revenues and unemployment and government expenditures as well through unemployment expenditure, especially in member states with a large government sector. And this impact of the economic cycle on public finances is, of course, not under control of or not directly under the control of the government, and countries should therefore not be penalized for the impacts of the cycle on the budget balance. And on the other hand, also member states should not get a positive assessment just because favorable economic conditions improve the budget balance. Since the 2005 reform, the budget balance is corrected for this positive or negative impact of the cycle, and then we call it the structural balance. And this became the main indicator to assess the member state's performance and to assess compliance with the budgetary requirements, both in the preventive arm as well in the corrective arm. So as an example, I show here the headline balance for Belgium in blue, and in red is the structural balance, so the budget balance corrected for the the cyclical impact and for one-off elements. Of course, to the structural balance, this red line is an estimate, and to estimate this line, to assess the structural balance, to assess the budget balance without the impact of the cycle, we have to estimate the impact of the economy, of the economic cycle, and we have to estimate if a member state is in good economic times or bad economic times. And the Commission uses for this the output gap methodology, but this has led to many discussions with member states about the exact position of a member state in the cycle. Because the more negative or the less positive the estimate of the output gap is, the larger the part of the deficit that can be attributed to the economic circumstances and not to government policies. So you see in 2009, for example, a big economic shock, and so a large part of the deficit was attributed to the cycle, and so the structural balance in red is above the headline balance. Is better than the headline balance. And this we also see, of course, with today's shock. The figures for 21 and 22 are based on the autumn forecast of the Commission for Belgium. Next week, the Commission will update its economic and budgetary forecasts for all member states. I will come back to this graph when we discuss the requirements for countries on the preventive arm and corrective arm. Then, following the economic and financial crisis of 2009, two other big reforms took place, so-called six-pack and two-pack reform in 2011 and 2013. The 2011 reform is what we call the six-pack legislation, reinforced the preventive and the corrective arm regulation and introduced two new indicators. It introduced the expenditure benchmark and where expenditure developments were monitored. I will come back to that. And also the debt reduction benchmark, which was an operationalization of the debt criterion. So initially, the pact focused on the 3%, afterwards on the structural, more on structural balance, and debt developments were not really looked at. And it's only with the 2011 reform that that debt and debt reduction and this treaty requirement to reduce debt sufficiently towards the set 60%. It's only since 2011 that this was really implemented in the secondary legislation. The six-pack also added some additional layers to the surveillance framework. Tried to have a better enforcement with a new sanction mechanism. There were more requirements for national budgetary frameworks, aiming to strengthen the framework at national level as a complement to the EU framework. For example, an increased role for independent institutions, such as in Belgium, the High Council for Finance or the Federal Planning Bureau. And then another element that was added with the six-pack reform was the macroeconomic imbalances, because the 2009 crisis had shown that member states could face a fiscal crisis, which in fact was the consequence of imbalances in the wider economy. For example, housing bubbles or an accumulation of risk in the financial sector, or a lack of competitiveness, and so on. And so it was considered important to also have a broader picture than just looking at the fiscal developments. Then in 2013, this six-pack reform was complemented with two other new legal texts, the so-called two-pack, which focused mostly on euro area member states. One element was that it aimed to strengthen ex-ante coordination of fiscal policy. So in order to avoid that the EU level only intervened when, in fact, it was already too late. So to have more ex-ante coordination. And it's at that time that this requirement to submit draft budgetary plans for the next year has been introduced in the EU legislation. Then another element of the two-pack reform was an increased focus on the aggregation of national fiscal policy, so what we call the fiscal stance at EU level or at euro area level, because there can be circumstances in which all national fiscal policies do not result in an appropriate aggregate euro area fiscal stance. And this was especially true after the 2009-2010 crisis, when a lot of member states consolidated at the same time, reduced their deficit at the same time, and which hampered the recovery in the euro area. And so in 2013, more focus also on the aggregate fiscal position of the euro area was introduced in legislation. And then this two-pack reform also has some provisions for member states under a support program. Then another evolution over time is the addition of more flexibility within the existing rules. At the start of the Juncker Commission in 2014, there were growing concerns that the EU fiscal rules were too rigid or would kill the modest economic recovery at the time. And so this is why the Commission and the Council decided at the time to clarify or reinterpret the flexibility that was already built in the Stability and Growth Pact. These changes were not done by a revision of the existing legal text, but were done by way of interpretation. So via communication that was subsequently endorsed or endorsed in a commonly agreed position by the member states. So this commonly agreed position, in fact, outlines how the flexibility within the fiscal rules could be best used to support growth. It focuses on 3 policy areas: the fiscal conduct over the economic cycle, with more differentiation between good times and bad times. Then also how to take into account structural reforms and how to make the framework more investment friendly. The introduction of more flexibility depending on cyclical conditions is, of course, something which makes economically sense, but at the same time, it also gives more weight to unobservable variables like the output gap, because again, you have to estimate the position of the economy in the economic cycle. Then for the structural reforms, there it was agreed that member states can have slower fiscal adjustment if at the same time they implement structural reforms with a long-term benefit for public finances. And Belgium, in fact, applied for this clause and benefited from the structural reform clause in 2019 because it implemented a number of reforms in the area of pensions, labor market reforms, and taxation. I guess you all know well these reforms. Then, lastly, the flexibility for investments means that under certain conditions, certain investment can be excluded from when assessing the compliance with fiscal rules, so-called investment clause. It was agreed that this clause was limited to countries that that were in a downturn, so there is a negative output gap condition, and that only in those times an increase in investment can be disregarded for the assessment of compliance. So in 2018, Belgium asked the Commission to review these eligibility conditions, and this is certainly something that will be discussed in the context of the review of the EU fiscal rules, on which I will give a presentation in 2 weeks from now. Then let me now jump to the working of the preventive arm. It applies to all countries that are under an excessive deficit procedure. It applies to all countries that are not under an excessive deficit procedure, and currently it means all member states except Romania. So all member states except Romania are currently in the preventive arm. I should know that we are currently in a kind of special situation, special regime, because many member states, in fact, breached the 3% of 3% of GDP deficit threshold. But currently, in fact, in March 2020, with the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Commission activated the so-called general escape clause of the Stability and Growth Pact, which was an innovation of the six-pack reform. It's the first time that this clause has been activated, and it can, in fact, it allows for a deviation of the fiscal rules in the case of severe economic downturn, which clearly is the case now. And so member states are now allowed to temporarily depart from the fiscal requirements in order to undertake a coordinated response to the crisis. So the rules that I explain now to you on the following slides are in fact currently not applied for 2020 and 21. And at the end of this month, the Commission will decide whether to deactivate the clause as of next year or to keep it active. So currently we are in this special regime, but what I present you is the normal regime as foreseen in the legislation. The goal of the preventive arm is to ensure that member states run prudent fiscal policies over the medium run. What is prudent fiscal policy? That is fiscal policy that is structurally sound, meaning that the budget should, on average, be close to balance over the economic cycle. So in structural terms. Then prudent fiscal policy also means that it should build buffers against bad times, meaning surpluses or debt reduction in good times, so that there is room for counter-cyclical policies in bad economic times. Then the third element of prudent fiscal policies is that it should build buffers against too high public debt to avoid unsustainable debt positions. And fourth, prudent fiscal policy should also build buffers against future liabilities, for example, aging costs. So meaning that member states should accumulate higher surpluses or should have lower deficits when it has a higher projected increase in aging costs. And then lastly, another element is that expenditure dynamics should remain under control. This doesn't mean that expenditure cannot increase or that there is a cap on the size of government, but it means that expenditure increases should be properly financed. So that were the basic elements underlying the construction of the rules of the preventive arm. How does this work in practice? Well, each member state has to set a medium-term budgetary objective. So this budgetary so member states should set such a medium-term budgetary objective and respect this, or if they are not yet at this objective, they should make adjustments towards this medium-term objective. And so a medium-term objective should respond to these 5 elements of prudent fiscal policy. So the MTO, medium-term budgetary objective, is the very central concept of the preventive arm. Member states can set a this MTO is country specific. It depends on member states' situation and is linked to the aims of the preventive arm. It should provide a safety margin with respect to the 3%, so that also in bad economic times, the member states remains below the 3% threshold, which at the time was set as the maximum deficits compatible with the economic and monetary union. Then a second element is that this medium-term objective should take into account the level of debt and the expected aging costs. So countries with high debt or higher aging costs should set a more ambitious or a higher medium-term objective in order to build buffers, as explained on the previous slide. And then thirdly, this medium-term objective should also provide room for investment, and this means that member states, most member states, in fact, can have a small deficit as medium-term objective, provided that it is fiscally sustainable. Then there is an additional requirement for euro area member states and member states that are in ERM2, which is that the MTO cannot be lower than a deficit of 1% of GDP. So that are the requirements for the minimum MTO that the member state can set. And the Commission calculates, in fact, every 3 years for each member state the minimum level of this medium-term budgetary objective. And member states are, of course, free to have a more ambitious one than this minimum MTO. In practice, the minimum MTO varies between member states, for some member states, structural surplus. For example, Luxembourg has a minimum MTO of 0.5% of GDP because it has a high projected cost of aging. Also, Italy has a surplus as minimum MTO due to its high public debt. On the other hand, you have member states that have a structural deficit, for example, of 1.5% of GDP for Poland and Sweden. So for most member states, in fact, a small deficit is sufficient to ensure sound fiscal buffers. For Belgium, the minimum MTO is a balanced budget with the debt and the implicit liabilities of aging being the binding factor, in fact, when determining the minimum MTO. This MTO is set in structural terms, so it means so corrected for the impact of the economic cycle. So it means that for Belgium, for example, that in normal economic times, the budget balance should be broadly around a balanced budget. In good economic times, the budget balance should be in surplus, and in bad economic times, a deficit is allowed. So the fact that the MTO is set in structural terms means that the budget balance can fluctuate according to the economic cycle. And so this allows for macroeconomic stabilization over the business cycle, which is also one of the aims of the preventive arm. Then what does the preventive arm require member states then exactly to do? So member states that have reached their MTO, they should just continue to respect it. And this was the case for around half of the member states before the current crisis. Countries that have not yet reached their MTO, they are required to improve their structural balance each year at an average pace of 0.5% of GDP a year. In practice, with the flexibility communication of 2015, the Commission and the Council refined this requirement in a so-called matrix of adjustment, which sets a higher adjustment requirement in good economic times and a lower adjustment requirement in bad economic times. Then this progress towards member states' medium-term objectives is assessed by the Commission on the basis of two indicators. On the one hand, the change in the structural balance, and on the other hand, also based on the expenditure benchmark. And the expenditure benchmark is in fact a translation of the required improvement into a maximum growth rate of expenditure. I will come back to this on one of the next slides. And so the requirement in terms of adjustment is set every spring for the next year. So by the Council, but based on a proposal by the Commission. Yeah, this is this matrix of requirements, which I mentioned. So depending on the position of the cycle and the debt level and sustainability risks, member states are required to implement a higher adjustment or a lower adjustment than this 0.5% of GDP per year. But I will not go into the detail of this matrix. Then here I show the distance of member states to their medium terms of the objectives before the current crisis, so in 2019. So It shows the difference between member states' structural budget balance and their individual medium-term objectives. And we see, in fact, three groups. On the left side, we see that nearly half of the member states, in fact, had overachieved their MTO, like Denmark, for example, and Germany. So they have high structural surpluses, or they had high structural surpluses, more than, in fact, what was required by their medium-term objective, more than their MTO, according to the EU legislation. Then we have a few countries in the middle that were at or relatively close to their MTO. And then on the right-hand side, we have some member states that, in fact, did not make a lot of adjustments prior to the current crisis. And so they had large structural deficits and were still far away from their MTO, like Spain, Romania, Belgium, France, and some other. And well, in fact, some of them are also the member states with the highest debt levels in the EU. And here I show again Belgium's headline balance in blue and structural balance in red, the graph I showed before. Between 2009 and 2013, Belgium was under the corrective arm of the pact, and so it needed to bring its headline deficit below the 3% limit, above the black line on the graph. I will come back on the corrective arm later in my presentation. Since 2014, Belgium is under the preventive arm, and so needed to gradually adjust towards the MTO. It's towards its country-specific MTO, which is shown as the black square. So initially, Belgium's MTO was a surplus of 0.75% of GDP, if I'm not mistaken. But in 2017, Belgium was able to lower its MTO thanks to revised aging projections following a number of changes in the pension system. So there, since 2017, the MTO is set at a balanced budget in structural terms. In fact, since 2018, Belgium moved further away from its MTO and didn't make progress anymore. To some extent, this was also due to the use of the flexibility for structural reform. So in 2019, the requirement for Belgium was not the usual 0.5% of GDP adjustment, but a requirement to keep the structural balance more or less stable. But in fact, we see that Belgium moved further away from its MTO in 2018 and 19. So the assessment of compliance with the preventive requirements, I partly mentioned this already. For member states that are at their MTO, the Commission only looks at the level of the structural balance, and if the MTO is respected, then everything is fine, and the assessment stops there. For member states that have not yet reached their medium-term objective, the Commission compares the improvement in the structural balance with the required improvement, the requirement that is set by the Council 1 year ahead. And the Commission looks not only to the improvement of the structural balance, but also at the expenditure benchmark. And then in spring and autumn, member states are assessed for the ongoing year, kind of in-year guidance, and also on the basis of their plans for the next year. And then in spring, member states are also assessed on the basis of the outcome for the previous years. If member states deviate significantly from their requirement, the Commission can launch a significant, or can propose to the Council to launch a significant deviation procedure. But this is only possible based on outturn data, so never based on plans by member states. What is now considered a significant deviation? It means that a member state deviates by more than 0.5% of GDP from its requirement on the structural balance or on the expenditure benchmark, or on average 0.25% of GDP over 2 years. But it's not mechanical. It's always based on an assessment of both the structural balance and the expenditure benchmark and possible factors that impact these indicators. So there is an assessment over 1 year and also over 2 years. Over 2 years, why? Because there's quite some uncertainty on the output gap, and there are annual fluctuations. So looking over 2 years gives a better picture of the underlying fiscal position. When a country is found at significant deviation and a significant deviation procedure is opened, the Council can then issue a recommendation with a fiscal effort to bring the country back on an appropriate adjustment path. Yeah, I've already mentioned that the compliance with the preventive arm is based on an assessment of the structural balance, but also on the basis of the expenditure benchmark. And what is this expenditure benchmark? It's in fact the other side of the coin is more or less the same as the structural balance. So it is a fiscal indicator that filters out the impact of the cycle, but is slightly different. So for countries at their MTO, the expenditure benchmark in fact puts a cap on expenditure growth in line with medium-term potential GDP. So if your economy in real terms grows by 1% a year, your expenditure can also grow in real terms by 1% a year, and then normally your structural position remains the same. So for member states at MTO, they remain then at MTO. We look at primary expenditure, and also we take into account new revenue measures. So expenditure can grow faster than this reference rate of potential GDP growth. But if it grows faster, your expenditure, you have to compensate it by new revenue measures. So it doesn't put a cap on the size of government. It just ensures that expenditure increases are properly financed. Also, cyclical impacts are filtered out, so unemployment benefits, for example, are not taken into account when looking at the net expenditure growth. For countries that did not yet achieve their MTO, their medium-term objective, the underlying fiscal position needs to improve year by year, according to the preventive arm, and so expenditure growth, net of discretionary revenues, should grow at a rate that is below this medium-term growth rate. And so the difference between the growth of your expenditure and the growth of potential GDP is calculated based on the required improvement. So as said, expenditure increases are of course still possible if they are matched by discretionary revenue measures. At the same time, when there are tax cuts, they normally deteriorate the fiscal position, so this should be matched by a slower growth in expenditure than the reference rate of potential GDP. So the expenditure benchmark, contrary to the structural balance, it measures more the elements of the budget that are directly under the control of the government, meaning primary expenditure and discretionary revenue measures. While the structural balance can still be impacted by revenue windfalls or revenue shortfalls that are outside the control of the government. Also, for example, the fact that interest rates go down or go up impacts interest expenditure. This impacts the structural balance in a positive or negative way. The expenditure benchmark only looks at primary expenditure, excluding the change in interest spending. So it's in fact a better indicator to assess the performance of member states. It was introduced in 2011 in the six-pack. So, and according to the legislation, the assessment is based on both structural balance and expenditure benchmark. But in agreement with the member states, the Commission puts an increasing focus on the expenditure benchmark, as it accounts more for the elements under control of the government. And so it gives more a truthful picture of member states' fiscal performance. I think these elements I've mentioned, so more the elements that are directly under the control of the government, less uncertainty than the structural budget balance, which is impacted by, still impacted by windfalls or shortfalls in revenues, apart from the cyclical the cyclical revenues. Also, the reference rate for the expenditure benchmark is a 10-year average economic growth rate or potential economic growth rate, which is a bit more stable than the output gap used for the structural budget balance. So it ensures that it wants to ensure that expenditure remains on a sustainable path, while revenues can fluctuate with the economic cycle. So that are the main elements of the preventive arm. So MTO, member states that are at the MTO should remain. Member states not yet at this medium-term budgetary objective have to make progress, assessed based on the change in structural balance and on the expenditure benchmark. Then let's now move on to the corrective arm of the pact. The aim of the corrective arm legislation is to deal with what is called in the treaty gross errors of fiscal policy. In practice, this means correcting excessive government deficits or debt. And an excessive deficit is evaluated against the criteria specified in the treaty and in the protocol annexed to the treaty. In the case of the deficit, it corresponds to a value that is above 3% of GDP, or a debt in excess of 60% of GDP, or not sufficiently diminishing towards that level. And so if a country is assessed to be in breach of one of these criteria, it is placed in an excessive deficit procedure. And this implies an enhanced scrutiny by the Commission and the Council. The breach of one of these criteria will not automatically lead to the opening of an excessive deficit procedure. The Commission prepares first a report when there is a breach. For example, if the deviation or the excess of the 3% is temporary and exceptional, and the deficit remains relatively close to the 3%, the Commission can decide not to open an excessive deficit procedure. Also for the debt, if the debt is not sufficiently diminishing towards the 60%, the Commission will prepare a report and assess what we call relevant factors that had an impact on the debt developments. Last year, the Commission prepared reports for almost all member states, because almost all member states, except Bulgaria, I think, planned breach of the 3% in 2020. For some member states, the report also covered the fact that there was insufficient debt reduction in 2019, including for Belgium. But in the context of the pandemic, the Commission reached the conclusion that the decision on whether to open an excessive deficit procedure should not be taken at that time. So it prepared a report, but without taking further steps because of the exceptional uncertainty created by the macroeconomic and fiscal impact of the pandemic, and including the uncertainty for designing a credible path of adjustment at the time. This spring, so as last year, the Commission intends to adopt again new reports to assess member states' deficits and debt situation. The Commission plans to adopt these reports on the 26th of May. Then again, the Commission will take into account the high uncertainty and also the agreed fiscal policy response to the COVID-19 crisis and the Council recommendations for 21. So these reports will be adopted at the end of this month, and then it remains to be seen if and when there would be openings of excessive deficit procedures. So the protocol annexed to the treaty says that should remain below 60% of GDP or sufficiently diminishing towards the 60%. And what is sufficiently diminishing? So as I said, this was only operationalized or defined in 2011 with the adoption of the six-pack reform. So it was defined as a reduction of the distance towards the 60% by, on average, 1/20th per year. So if a member state, for example, has a debt of 100%, the ratio should decrease by 2 percentage points per year on average. So meaning 1/20th of the gap to 60%, so 1/20th of 40. So as said, if the debt reduction benchmark then is not respected, the Commission prepares a report to the Council to assess relevant factors. This can be the economic situation, also the extent to which member state complied with the preventive arm requirements, or other elements that have impacted the debt ratio. For example, for Belgium, since 2014, the Commission prepared almost every year a report due to insufficient reduction in the debt and non-respect of this debt reduction benchmark. But then it was taken into account, for example, in 2013-14, that there was very low inflation and relatively low growth, which made it more challenging to put the debt on a downward path, on a sufficiently downward path. The Commission also took into account that Belgium was broadly compliant with the required adjustment towards the MTO under the preventive arm, and also undertook a number of structural reforms which contributed to debt sustainability in the medium and long term. So based on an assessment of these relevant factors, an excessive deficit procedure was then not opened, even if at face value Belgium did not respect this debt reduction benchmark. Then, if the Commission considers that the opening of the excessive procedure is warranted, and this is endorsed by the Council, then the Commission proposes a recommendation with a deadline for correction and with annual budgetary targets. For example, for Belgium, this was the case in 2009. Belgium exceeded 3%, as many other member states. A deadline for correction was given in 2012 with an adjustment path to bring the deficit again below the 3%. At the time, the adjustment was, of course, hampered by the fact that for a long period there was no government with full budgetary powers. Then the Council amends or adopts this recommendation. And from then onwards, the member states has 3 to 6 months to take measures and to regularly submit a report to the Commission, and then the Commission assesses if the member state has taken effective action and reports this to the Council. So this excessive deficit procedure under the corrective arm is a kind of reinforced surveillance. And only when the deficit is brought in a durable manner below 3% of GDP and the debt reduction benchmark is fulfilled or expected to be fulfilled according to the Commission forecast, then the Council can abrogate the EDP, the excessive deficit procedure, and the country moves again to the preventive arm of the pact and again needs to make progress towards its MTO. Then another change that was introduced in 2013 is or 2011 was a reinforced sanction mechanism. Before there were already some sanctions in the framework, but they came very late in the process, and it was felt that this should be reinforced to have more fiscal discipline, and that sanctions should come earlier in the process. In practice, in fact, these sanctions have never been applied, as it turned out very difficult to sanction member states in a field like public finances that is really at the heart of the sovereignty of member states. But to some extent, these sanctions have worked as a threat, I would say. We'll come back on this when we present the assessment in the context of the review in 2 weeks' time. There's also the possibility, as part of the sanction mechanism, to suspend commitments or payments under structural funds. This falls a bit outside the scope of the Stability and Growth Pact, but there is conditionality for macroeconomic. There is macroeconomic conditionality in structural funds, and a non-compliance with recommendations of the excessive deficit procedure can also lead to a temporary suspension of structural funds. This I mentioned already. So since March 2020, the Commission activated the General Escape Clause, which in the preventive arm allows member states to temporarily depart from the adjustment path towards the medium-term budgetary objective. The only condition is that that should not endanger fiscal sustainability in the medium term. And then for the corrective arm, which is currently only Romania, the fact this General Escape Clause allows to revise the fiscal trajectory of the excessive deficit procedure, even if a member state did not take effective action, did not respond to the EDP recommendation. In the case of severe economic downturn, the Council can revise the trajectory to take into account these changed economic circumstances. I think this brings me to the end of my presentation. I have some links. I guess the slides will be distributed, but in any case, the links provide you some more background. Also, the vademecum on the Stability and Growth Pact, which is kind of handbook summarizing all the legislation in around 100 pages, but that's already less than the legislation itself. Good. And here are a few other links with where you can find more information. Good. I think now is the moment to ask any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting. Je pense qu'avec Chris, on va pouvoir classer les questions en deux catégories. Il y a des questions vraiment, entre guillemets, relativement pointues et spécifiques. Et puis, je dois rappeler évidemment à toutes les personnes qui sont présentes à ce webinaire que la prochaine présentation, notre conférencier reviendra avec Monsieur De Bruyne du European Fiscal Board pour présenter l'évaluation et déjà, entre guillemets, une première analyse de cette gouvernance budgétaire européenne. Donc, le challenge d'aujourd'hui était de présenter, entre guillemets, le modèle, parce que faire les deux en même temps, et les règles budgétaires et l'évaluation, peut-être que c'était beaucoup d'informations en une seule fois. Donc, c'est pour ça qu'on avait décidé de le faire en 2 étapes. Monsieur Van Houten, il y a une question qui revient régulièrement. C'est d'abord, tout le monde se demande quand même d'où viennent ces 3%, d'où viennent ces 60%. Donc, c'est peut-être bien une fois de rappeler, on parle tout le temps des 3%, des 60%. Comment a-t-on fixé ces 3% et 60%? Donc ça, c'est une des questions que beaucoup de gens se posent. Et l'autre question, ici pour commencer, c'est est-ce que quelque chose est encore appliqué dans la gouvernance budgétaire européenne où les clauses de flexibilité ont tout mis entre parenthèses et entre guillemets, on ne contrôle plus rien, on ne surveille plus rien. Donc ça, c'est peut-être les 2 premières questions qui ne sont déjà pas simples, évidemment, à répondre. Le 3%, le 60%, et qu'est-ce qui est d'application aujourd'hui en termes de gouvernance budgétaire européenne, s'il y a encore quelque chose qui est d'application. On va peut-être répondre à cette première série, puis Christ vous en posera, et puis on fera, voilà, on va relayer.
Oui, merci beaucoup. Oui, les 60%, bon, il y a plusieurs versions de comment c'est arrivé dans le traité. C'est tout d'abord quand la France et l'Allemagne et d'autres États membres au début des années 90 ont négocié l'Union économique et monétaire. Maintenant, il y a aussi une base économique, bien évidemment. C'est aussi un niveau de dette qui était considéré comme soutenable. Maintenant, il est vrai que les conditions entre-temps ont changé. Les taux d'intérêt sont beaucoup plus bas que à ce moment-là dans les années 90. Donc, c'est vrai qu'il y a beaucoup de discussions si ce 60% a encore du sens. Il ne faut pas plutôt évoluer vers un 90%. Ou un autre chiffre. Ce que j'ai voulu accentuer dans la présentation, c'est aussi que cette limite de 60% n'est pas appliquée d'une manière mécanique et qu'il y a toujours une évaluation et même la réduction vers les 60% est aussi toujours évaluée sur base d'une évaluation globale et certainement pas mécanique. Et puis le 3%, un peu la même histoire. Le 3%, ça correspond à stabiliser la dette à 60% si la croissance nominale est de 5%, donc 2% d'inflation et 3% de croissance réelle. Maintenant, on peut dire aussi que ça n'est plus adapté à la situation d'aujourd'hui. Et c'est certainement aussi un élément qui est débattu dans le cadre du review qu'on a maintenant sur la gouvernance européenne. Mais je pense que ça serait très difficile de trouver un nouveau compromis sur des nouvelles chiffres. Donc, je crains que ces chiffres resteront toujours là, mais bon, peut-être les changements seraient plutôt comment ces chiffres sont évalués et comment on les applique. Je pense là, peut-être il y aura plus de marge, mais c'est à voir. C'est un débat qui doit encore avoir lieu, qui a lieu, mais qui n'est pas terminé. Oui, je ne sais plus la deuxième partie de la question.
Est-ce que certaines règles sont encore appliquées aujourd'hui, ou tout est suspendu par la clause de flexibilité?
Non, il y a toujours la condition qui fait partie du General Escape Clause que la soutenabilité doit être garantie. Et donc, il y a toujours une évaluation de la soutenabilité. Mais en même temps, oui, la Commission et le Conseil a clairement dit que maintenant, il faut soutenir l'économie, donc il faut dépenser ou il faut prendre des mesures. Mais ce qui est crucial pour garantir la soutenabilité, c'est que ces mesures sont de nature temporaire et bien targeted, focalisées là où ils ont le plus d'impact. Et donc temporaire, que ces mesures vont être automatiquement retirées du moment que la situation économique s'améliore. Donc au mois de mars, la Commission a adopté une communication un peu avec une sorte de avec des orientations pour les programmes de stabilité des États membres. Et donc c'est clairement à court terme, oui, soutenir l'économie, avoir une politique budgétaire expansive sans trop de contraintes et règles budgétaires, mais au moyen terme, il faut retourner à des positions saines, des positions sound fiscal positions, des positions fiscales budgétaires qui sont soutenables. Voilà.
Oké. Er is ook iemand die vraagt, ja, waarom is er eigenlijk geen inkomstennorm en focust men enkel op die uitgavennorm? Is daar?
Ja, goede vraag. Die uitgavenbenchmark, die naam is leidend, want het is eigenlijk zowel een benchmark voor uitgaven als inkomsten, omdat ook de inkomstenmaatregelen mee zijn genomen. Dus er wordt gekeken naar de groei van de uitgaven min de groei van de inkomsten. En de groei van de inkomsten wordt alleen gekeken naar de nieuwe maatregelen en niet de groei van inkomsten door meevallers. Dus het is niet enkel een limiet op de uitgaven. Het is eigenlijk een concept dat zowel de inkomstenzijde als de uitgavenzijde bekijkt. Maar aan de inkomstenzijde wordt er maatregel per maatregel eigenlijk gekeken, terwijl voor de uitgaven gewoon de globale groei van de uitgaven wordt gekeken, omdat het aan de uitgavenzijde eigenlijk heel moeilijk is om een onderscheid te maken tussen wat is een discretionaire uitgavenmaatregel en wat is niet discretionair. Ja. Dus het concept is ruimer dan enkel uitgaven. Okay. Dan enkel uitgaven. Sorry.
Dan hebben we ook nog een vraag van Renaat Gansens en Daan. Ja, hoe kijkt men terug naar de inschatting van de output gap in het verleden? Werd de omvang van de conjuncturele schommelingen goed ingeschat? En wat leert dat eventueel voor de toekomst? Waarom hield de Europese Commissie geen rekening met de kritiek dat de berekening van de output gap eigenlijk vertekend is en procyclisch effect heeft? Voilà. Ja, en ik zie ook dat er iemand vraagt om misschien ook in het Engels de Q&A te doen. Anders kunt u misschien in het Engels antwoorden.
Yes. Yeah, no problem. Regarding the output gap methodology, it's well recognized that it's not perfect, and in fact, a lot of adjustments have been made over the years in agreement with member states. There is even a special output gap working group that only discusses the methodology underlying this method. So it's a commonly agreed method, where also some country-specific elements have been taken into account to have indeed an even better measure. But I mean, I think even with the best method, you will always have discussions on the output gap, because it has real consequences where you put how you assess the cycle. So there is an interest of member states to underestimate the negative output gap, or to overestimate the negative output gap, or to underestimate the positive output gap. So yeah, every method will lead to discussions. And one of the important evolutions over the last year is that we moved more and more to this expenditure benchmark, which is a lot less impacted by the output gap discussions. In fact, the output gap doesn't enter the calculation anymore. The only thing that is still an unobservable variable is the fact that you measure the expenditure growth, net of discretionary measures, compared to a reference rate of economic growth. And for this reference rate, we use the 10-year average potential growth, and this potential growth of an economy is, of course, still something which is estimated, which cannot be observed, which can still lead to discussions, but it's the 10-year average already. It filters out a lot of the problems of the procyclicality of the output gap, as was mentioned in the question. So these problems with the output gap we try to address them, and we continue to work on this for sure. And any discussion on the reform of the fiscal rules will have to take into account the experience we have with the output gap. That is clear.
Okay. We have another question from Renaat Hansens. He wants to know, how do you declare, how can you explain that the structural balance is 1 percentage point lower than the nominal balance in 2019 in times of ordinary growth of 1.5%?
Okay, I will maybe go back to the slide.
Yeah.
So 2019, yes, so indeed the structural balance is worse than the headline balance, because there was a positive output gap. So there was the economy was in good period. So the headline balance included rather dynamic tax revenues, which were not really linked to the underlying fiscal position, but which were thanks to the economic situation. And then there might also be an impact of one-offs. I know that there were also some temporary revenues in corporate income taxation, which were brought forward, like companies had a regime where they could make more advanced payments, which brought temporarily forward some tax revenues. So there was a shift in timing from paying corporate taxes ex post towards more advanced payments, and this temporarily improved the headline balance in 2018 and 19, and so the structural balance corrects also for this factor, because it was not really an improvement in the underlying fiscal position. It was just a shift in timing. So I think these two elements, the one-offs and then the fact that we were in a positive output gap territory, make that the structural balance was worse than the headline balance. I hope this answers the question.
Okay. Yeah, then there was a question on state asset sales. A sale of state assets can force down the debt in the short term, but push up spending in the long term. How is this taken into account in the implementation of the debt reduction?
Yeah. Yeah, this does not directly enter the definition of the debt reduction benchmark, or let's say the sale of assets will indeed make compliance with the debt reduction benchmark easier. Your debt goes down, which looks good, but maybe it's not a good measure. That's true, and that's why there is always an assessment to assess, and indeed if a debt reduction benchmark is worse or the others are improved thanks to sale of assets. These are elements that are taken into account in the assessment. Of course, even member state debt goes down sufficiently, we cannot open a procedure saying your debt goes down, but in fact it's due to a bad measure. No, so there indeed is a kind of bad incentive built in the rules. On the other hand, if you don't comply with the debt reduction benchmark, because you had, for example, to intervene in the financial sector and this was needed to rescue the financial system, we will not open a procedure, or we will not propose to open a procedure because of the debt impact of this measure, but we will take into account the need for this intervention or for this purchase, which increased the debt. So again, it's not a mechanical application of the benchmark.
Ok, je vois encore une question aussi de Luc Denayer. Est-il correct de dire que la réponse de la politique budgétaire en Europe est essentiellement basée sur la possibilité de laisser jouer le stabilisateur automatique, excepté dans des circonstances économiques exceptionnelles, comme c'est le cas maintenant dans l'actuelle crise de Covid? Et est-ce que cela représente une grande différence par rapport aux États-Unis?
Yeah. No, yeah, it's certainly correct. So indeed, the framework is built on the fact that member states should be allowed to allow automatic stabilizers to play. So the fluctuations of revenue and expenditure that depend on the cycle, and that in the meantime, the underlying we should look at the underlying fiscal position where member states should adjust. But there is still some, I mean, the adjustment is higher in good economic times and the adjustment is lower or even zero in bad economic times. So it's even in structural terms. So there is not only this element of automatic stabilizer, but there is to some extent also some leeway for discretionary fiscal policy. And then, of course, in situations of severe economic downturn, like now, the current crisis, indeed, this general escape clause allows for a very massive discretionary fiscal policy. Maybe indeed the EU governments have less, the governments of EU member states have less space for discretionary fiscal policy as in the United States. At the same time, the automatic stabilizers in Europe are much bigger, so there is more an automatic stabilization, and which is perfectly allowed under the rules.
Okay, there is also a question about the real power of the Commission to implement the fiscal pact.
Yeah, the experience of the last years is certainly that the Commission can only go as far as the consensus in the Council, and the Council is well. There are of course many different positions in the Council, but yeah, the Commission is not purely technocratic institution which can determine purely based on the numbers or on the legislation how the pact should be implemented. There has been an increased role on paper for the Commission, but at the same time, this has put the Commission in an increasingly political role because the Commission got more power to propose sanctions, got more power to launch procedures. But this has also increased the political pressure on the Commission, and I think the Juncker Commission, but then afterwards also this Commission realized that this power should be used very prudently, and of course the Commission needs the member states also in many other areas. and it cannot go completely against the member states. So it's more like a cooperation with the council, this implementation of fiscal rules. And this is also something that is discussed in the review. To what extent these changes in 2011 to strengthen the role of the Commission actually, in fact, in practical terms, strengthened the Commission in reality.
And another question is, there is not a contradiction between the European recovery plan and the fiscal plan, the fiscal rules. How is it possible to maintain the recovery plan in few years and to combine with the fiscal pact?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there's not really a contradiction. For this year, there is still the general escape clause, so member state can deviate from the rules. For next year, we will have to see to what extent member states are still allowed to deviate. And then we have the European Recovery and Resilience Fund, which supports member states to increase investment and which in fact provides an opportunity for member states to improve their underlying position, because of course all expenditure that is financed by the EU will not impact the budget balance. So member states can keep budgetary support to the economy thanks to the RRF, to this European Recovery and Resilience Facility, and at the same time, sorry, I hear myself. At the same time, they can improve their underlying positions, of course, when the recovery is sufficiently advanced to withdraw these support measures. So, in fact, it's not a contradiction, but it's rather an opportunity. This European Recovery Fund will allow member states to continue to support while at the same time improve their underlying fiscal positions. So this is certainly something which should be taken into account by member states in their fiscal planning, and which will also be taken into account when member states when the Commission will propose recommendations for member states at the end of this month.
Ok, encore une petite question de Luximar aussi qui demande, oui, la règle d'or, hein, l'équilibre entre les recettes et les dépenses courantes, serait-elle utile pour relancer durablement l'investissement public?
Yeah, this is also an element which I would like to discuss in 2 weeks from now. So yeah, the règle d'or has, or golden rule, has of course some interesting features, but at the same time it has some risks by putting certain expenditure outside of the framework. Not all investment or not all gross fixed capital formation is necessarily growth enhancing or contributing to better medium term positions. So it's something which will have to be seen. In fact, yeah, sometimes the pact and the budgetary rules are set to hamper investment, but often, in fact, it's the choice of member states to cut in investment and not in some other expenditure items. So I'd say it's more up to member states to safeguard investments. And of course, in the assessments, we also always look to what extent investment, I mean, if there is, for example, a breach of the 3% and it's due to investment, it will be taken into account. It's explicitly mentioned also as a relevant factor. So there are already some elements that take into account the special role of investment in the economy. But then to go for a real golden rule. I think there are also some dangers. But it's something, the role of how the framework, what role the framework should take in encouraging investment is something which the Commission also wants to discuss in the context of the review.
Okay. Also, Herman Michele Warciarko say a bit the same. It said that the strict EU rules make big government investments impossible. How should a government proceed if it intends to make large multi-year investment projects on infrastructure, energy transition, and etc.?
Yeah, I would not say that it makes it impossible. Governments can still launch large investment projects, but they should be properly financed. And of course, some member states have more leeway also to have debt-financed investments. The problem is a bit for countries like Belgium that debt is already very high. The deficit is also high, and even in 2019, after a relatively good economic, a number of relatively good economic years, the deficit remained high. So this reduces, of course, the scope for debt-financed investment. I think now in the coming years is a certain very good opportunity with this recovery and resilience facility, where there will be EU funding for big infrastructure or for big investment projects, not necessarily infrastructure, and for projects that contribute to the green and digital transition of Europe.
Alors, il y a une question très précise de Michel Sindrin. Il demande si est-ce qu'il est correct de dire que dans les règles actuelles, c'est le niveau de la dette et la dette liée au vieillissement qui limite la possibilité de faire des grands investissements.
For Belgium, to some extent, yes, because the MTO, to calculate the MTO, the binding factor, the most demanding factor is indeed for Belgium the aging cost combined with the high public debt, which makes that Belgium's MTO is a balanced budget in structural terms, while for some other member states with lower debt or with a lower projected increase in aging cost, a deficit could be possible as an MTO, and so no requirement for those member states to evolve towards a balanced budget in structural terms.
Ok. Est-ce quand on regarde le volet préventif, est-ce que finalement le critère sur l'évolution des dépenses, il n'est pas utilisé comme un second best et que c'est toujours le first best, c'est le déficit structurel?
Well, for countries that are at their medium-term objective, we look only at the structural balance, and once they reach their MTO, which is in structural balance terms, it's fine. For member states where we assess the progress towards their MTO, we look at, in the first place, in fact, at the expenditure benchmark. And when the expenditure benchmark is fulfilled, except if there are very special circumstances, but normally we would say the country is compliant. So the expenditure benchmark is the prime indicator, I would say, because economically it's the preferable indicator, because it's more the elements that are directly under control of the government. It's based on a 10-year average reference rate of the economic growth potential and not based on the output gap. So for these reasons, the expenditure benchmark is considered the first best.
Okay.
Voilà, on a encore une question de Luc Deneyer. Pourquoi l'Union économique et monétaire accroît-il le risque de non prise en compte par les États membres des conséquences du déficit sur la soutenabilité budgétaire?
Sorry, I think I missed the first part of your question.
Yes. Pourquoi l'Union économique et monétaire accroît-il le risque de non prise en compte par les États les conséquences du déficit sur la soutenabilité budgétaire? C'est pas clair.
Yes. Yes, because well, the part of the increased risk will fall on other member states by an increase in market interest rates. This was especially the thinking in the 90s, after when there was really the idea of convergence, that all member states would have the same, or that spreads would go really would disappear, and that all member states would be assessed in the same way by financial markets. Now the thinking is more that member states can have unsustainable policies because they know that other member states will in the end intervene to avoid a collapse of the economic and monetary union. So these are the spillovers I mentioned, the spillovers of risk, and the fact that that this strengthens the deficit bias of governments.
And maybe there are a lot of questions about the flexibility about investment.
Yes.
Maybe it's necessary to explain again the condition of this flexibility. And maybe the question also is the conditions are not too much restrictive about the investment, and what is the restriction about flexibility about investment with the European recovery plan?
Yeah. Okay. I think I have an extra slide in the back with more information on the here on the investment clause. So yeah, indeed, there were some conditions. First of all, it was linked at the European investment plan that was launched at the time. So it was for projects that were co-funded by the EU. This was a way to ensure that it were a high quality project, that there was a kind of quality check of the investment project, and that it was not just for no matter what investment. So that was a first condition, and I don't know if I have others. Yeah, indeed. So it was only on the preventive arm, for member states under the preventive arm, that they could use this investment clause, the investment clause which allowed a lower adjustment in order to be able to increase in public investment. Then the most important or most famous condition is probably the fact that it can only be used when GDP growth is negative or the GDP is well below its potential, so a negative output gap that is below minus 1.5% of GDP. And this was intended, well, it's a compromise. Of course, some argue that such a condition was not needed. Others feared that an overly relaxation of the rules in good economic times, where they said they should be an instrument only in negative economic conditions, then an increase in investment can help to support the economy, while in good times an increase in investment should be financed by new tax revenues or by lower current expenditure. So the idea was to have it only, that it was only warranted to have debt financed investment only in downturns. And then the other condition is that the safety margin against the 3% should be preserved. Of course, public investment should not decrease, and it's not otherwise, if it's just to keep the, I mean, if it's allowed to deviate from the fiscal requirements, there should of course be a positive impact on investment, and the MTO should still be reached within 4 years. So there should be a plan to return to a sound and stable fiscal position. So in fact, yeah, it means that some investment projects would not be taken into account when assessing the progress towards the MTO. Yeah, I hope this sufficiently clarifies, but it's true that not many member states have been able to use this investment clause, because by the time that it was introduced in 2015, most member states, in fact, had already recovered from the 2009 recession, and I think only Italy and Finland and some of the Baltics benefited from this clause. So it's only also something that will be taken into account in the review, to see to what extent there can be other mechanisms to preserve or to encourage investment.
Thank you very much. Chris, tu as encore des questions, toi?
Oui, ben, je vois encore une dernière, à mon avis, un peu plus oui, générale, de Monsieur Étienne Cassier. He says only a few specialists understand the figures and the computation, and how and when will the European Commission reconnect with the European citizens and explain the value added for the European citizens of all this? That's a difficult one.
Well, I agree that it's very complex. If we would have just the 3%, it would be easier, but it would not be economically sounder. So yeah, I think we try to do our best to explain, but of course it's very technical things, and but I don't. Yeah, I think this is so in the context of fiscal rules, but I think personally I also think that it's very difficult to know exactly how CO2 reductions are calculated and why certain countries have to reduce their CO2 by so much percent, and how this is measured, and why certain sectors are taken into account and other not. I mean, just to give an example, if you want to make things smart and at the same time politically acceptable, and it's always a compromise between many member states, things will automatically become more complex. But yeah, I agree that maybe it's needed to explain better the fiscal rules. Then one last thing is also the fact that member states often like to blame the EU level for certain difficult decisions that need to be taken at national level, while it's not always directly the consequence of EU rules, but it's more national decisions.
Okay, it's also our ambition to try with our public debate here to explain a bit more to the civil society and also the citizens what's going on, what's good, what has to be revised, or voilà, that's a bit also our mission now to help the normal citizens, not specialists, not economists, to understand also a bit what is happening with the budget. Okay, I think we had all questions. It's almost 5 o'clock.
Oui, donc merci beaucoup. Donc la première, évidemment, conférence avait pour but d'expliquer tous ces concepts, pour les réexpliquer, et la technicité, évidemment, de ces concepts. Et on voit à quel point ils ne sont pas simples à maîtriser. Dans 15 jours, donc je rappelle, je pense que c'est le 18 mai, donc je remercie encore M. Van Houten d'être venu aujourd'hui, mais d'être présent également dans 15 jours avec M. Debrun. pour justement passer à l'étape suivante, qui est l'évaluation de cette gouvernance budgétaire européenne, qui s'est fortement complexifiée évidemment depuis la crise économique et financière de 2008-2009 et qui va commencer à alimenter le débat. Hein. Donc pour l'instant, on a essayé de remettre tout le monde à niveau, hein, mais on voit que c'était nécessaire parce qu'un certain nombre de concepts ne sont pas maîtrisés ni compris et on voit à quel point ils sont complexes. Et donc à partir de la semaine dans 15 jours, on pourra analyser, entre guillemets, et évaluer cette gouvernance budgétaire et voir comment on peut essayer de l'améliorer, mais ça sera l'objet de nos nombreuses conférences en 2020 et en 2021. Donc, je remercie toutes les personnes qui étaient présentes aujourd'hui et je vous souhaite une bonne après-midi. Graag dank u wel aan iedereen.
Dank u wel.
Hartelijk dank en tot de volgende keer.
Ja, tot ziens. Bedankt.
Bedankt.